Thanks, Christy. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me for this webinar today. If you missed part one, don't worry. I'm going to briefly review that information, and the video is available on the Read Naturally website, and I think Christy's going to put that in the chat for us as well. So today we'll be talking about the foundational skills that every student needs to master in order to become a proficient reader. We know that we have to plan our instruction by following our standards. The standards tell us what students should be able to do by the end of each grade, but the standards don't tell us specifically how we should teach those skills. Just as a reminder, part one of the webinar focused on print concepts and phonological awareness. Then today we'll be discussing the standards and research that guide our instruction in phonics and word recognition and fluency. So here's our agenda for today. Hopefully you have the handout, which includes the webinar slides and some helpful takeaways, which are tools that you can use when you plan your instruction in your classroom. I hope they're useful to you. We know that instruction should be based on standards and research, and I'll be referencing specific standards and research studies for the foundational reading skills throughout this webinar today. The introduction to the Common Core state standards reminds us that the focus of the standards is on results rather than on the means to get there. Since the standards tell us what to teach, but not how, we are free to use our professional judgment and experience to identify the tools and the knowledge that will be most helpful for meeting the goals. And that's really where the art of teaching comes in. We want to be able to use what we know works best with students to help them reach those goals. In this webinar, I'm going to briefly review some key research findings about reading development and revisit some predictors of reading success. We need to keep in mind which content is critical and which strategies are most effective to teach that content. Then we use that knowledge to plan and prioritize our instruction and get better results for our students. Let's take a closer look at the foundational reading skills. The foundational reading skills are the building blocks for literacy development, and they include specific goals for beginning readers all the way up through fifth graders for the areas of print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition, and fluency. If we want to develop readers who can comprehend texts across a range of types and disciplines, they need to have a solid foundation in these basic skills. So today we're going to start out taking a look at phonics and word recognition. Remember, our last webinar, we ended up talking about phonological awareness. And we know that phonological awareness and phonics instruction overlap. When students begin learning phonics skills, they learn the relationship between a specific sound or phoneme and the letter or letters that represent the sound, the grapheme. And phonemic awareness instruction and phonics instruction can happen at the same time in a beginning reading classroom, according to the International Dyslexia Association. We're going to start by looking at two different types of words. Look at the two sets of words here, one in black print and one in red print, and think about what you notice about them. Word recognition involves two different types of words. We have our regular words on the left, which are the words which students can decode by sounding them out, and the irregular words on the right in the red print. These are the words that students can't completely decode by sounding them out. So in the beginning stages of phonics instruction, an irregular word can also be a word that a student doesn't have the specific phonics skills to read yet. Let's give an example. The words new and no are irregular words until a student learns that together those letters K and N say the N sound. Once they've been taught that together the letters K, N say N, those words aren't irregular anymore. And that's assuming that they've also been taught the vowel patterns EW and OW. So new and no move from irregular to regular because now a student knows how to decode them. What does the research say about how we learn to read and spell regular and irregular words? There have been decades of debate about whether or not the brain uses a single route method for reading and spelling all types of words. Researchers used fMRI neuroimaging data to show that different parts of the brain are in fact active based on whether a word had irregular or regular spelling patterns. And as we talk about phonics and word recognition, we're going to label these two types of words. We'll call regular words that can be decoded the sound out words, and irregular words that have to be learned by memory we'll call spell out words. So this research has implications for how we teach these two types of words. Because our brains learn sound out words and spell out words differently, they also need to be taught differently. Here's what the standards tell us about the big picture of phonics and word recognition for sound out words. Remember, those are the decodable words. Students need to be able to know and apply grade level phonics and word analysis skills when decoding words. Let's look at what the research tells us. What percentage of words in English do you think are decodable? It might be more than you think. About 50% of English words have regular spelling patterns. That means that each sound in a word matches the letter or letters that represent the sound, like these examples: black, hot, and plain. Then another 37% of words in English have only one error if you try to spell them by matching each sound to the letter or letters that represent the sound. And usually that error happens in spelling a vowel sound. A good example is the word temperature. Even though most of that word is decodable, the vowel in the third syllable in temperature needs to be learned. Remember, all vowels sometimes make the schwa sound, A student can almost read the word or spell it, temperature, by sounding it out, but they need to learn by memory that the schwa sound in this word is made by the vowel A. Research clearly shows the value of systematic explicit phonics instruction, and that makes sense when you realize that 50% of words are decodable in English and another 37% have just one exception. That means the remaining 13% of words in English must be learned by memory as irregular words, like ocean. Another important emphasis of phonics and word recognition is learning high frequency words. Here's what the standards tell us about high frequency words. And what does the research tell us? Think about this. 8 words account for 18% of all the written material in English, 25 words for 33%, 100 words for 50%, and 300 words for 65%. Many schools assess students in the early grades to monitor their progress in learning to read and spell high frequency words accurately and automatically. And that makes sense when we see that teaching and assessing those first 300 high frequency words, it's going to have a big payoff for us in the classroom because it will help our students to read and spell up to 65% of the words they need. Here's a really helpful takeaway for you. You can find a copy of this, a full page copy, on page 26 in your handout. There are lots of lists of high frequency words out there, but this page is great because it organizes the first 200 high frequency words into some helpful categories. The column on the left-hand side lists the high frequency words that have irregular spelling patterns in their order of frequency. These words are going to be permanently irregular. They'll never move over to that regular side because they have to be learned by memory and they should be taught as spell out words. And we'll talk about teaching spell out words in just a little bit. The columns on the right-hand side of the page list the high frequency words with regular spelling patterns, and they're organized by common vowel spellings. They should be taught as sound out words in phonics or spelling lessons featuring that corresponding pattern. So think for a minute about your current curriculum. Since we know that high frequency words make up a large percentage of the words that students use in reading and writing, it makes sense that learning to read and spell these words should be a high priority. Let's look at a sample lesson for beginning readers that combines research-based strategies for phonemic awareness and phonics skills. At the beginning of the lesson, the teacher says, "Today we're going to learn about the digraph TH," and point it out. The sound of TH can either be voiced or unvoiced. I said that wrong. The sound of TH can either be unvoiced or voiced. Listen while I say each sound of TH. Now say the sounds with me. Ready? Now listen for TH in this word, thin. You hear it at the beginning, right? Now I'm going to take away that visual and I'm going to ask my students to look at me. Listen to each word that I say. If you hear the th or the sound in the word, put your thumb up. If not, put your thumb down. Listen, those. Do you hear th or th in those? How about rack? Do you hear th or th in rack? And we would continue with some more words with and without those voiced and unvoiced sounds until we really feel confident that our students can hear those sounds, both at the beginning, the middle, and the end of different words. And that's a great phonemic awareness activity. Later in the lesson, after students have practiced blending and segmenting words with the featured patterns, I would show the students this page with letters and sets of letters. Listen as I read the teacher's script. Look at these letters. These letters are the consonants T and H. When T is followed by H, these consonants form a digraph. The digraph TH can say th or th. What sounds? And they've already seen the digraph, they know the sounds, so they'll be able to confidently say those sounds again. Then next, I would go to all the different letters and combinations on this page and go through saying those sounds with the students, having the students repeat the sounds with me. The next step in the lesson is to read words in isolation that will appear in the story at the end of the lesson. What do you notice about the words that are in red font? That's right, they're high frequency words. This lesson applies the brain research we talked about earlier to teach sound out words and spell out words differently. The words in black font are sound out words because a student can sound out those words based on their knowledge of the individual letters and letter pairs that make the individual sounds. The words in red font are spell out words. Students will learn these words using the read the word, spell the word, read the word again routine for learning those spell out words by memory. Here's an example. We've got a systematic strategy for teaching students how to learn to spell words with irregular spelling patterns, those spell out words. The strategy is based on the brain research we looked at earlier, and it supports word-specific memory. We're going to read the word, spell the word, and then read the word again. So I'll be the teacher. Look at this high frequency word, out. The word out has two sounds, out. You already know the sound the letter T makes is T. Now you need to learn about the other letters in the word out. Say the sounds and then read the word with me. Ready? Out. We call this word a spell out word. To learn this word well, you will read it, spell it, then read it again. Look and listen. Out. O-U-T. Out. Now do it with me. Ready? Out. O-U-T. Out. Now it's your turn. Ready? out, O-U-T, out. So these activities that I've just shown you are from our program Gate Plus, which is a great beginning reading structured intervention for whole group or small groups. Now let's talk about some other areas in phonics and word recognition. Most phonics programs will teach students to decode accurately, but learning those skills doesn't guarantee that students are able to decode words automatically. From the research, we know that in order to become fluent readers, students need to learn to decode unknown words accurately and automatically. Because students who are using all of their mental energy to sound out individual words won't be able to focus on the meaning of what they're reading. And remember, our ultimate goal is comprehension. In fact, research shows that students who haven't developed automaticity at reading individual words by the beginning of second grade are at risk for reading failure. And we see these students come up in our third, fourth, and fifth grade classrooms. Here's an example of a phonics lesson that uses a strategy to build automaticity in decoding words in isolation. Notice that the words going down the columns here are organized as word families, or they're grouped together because they have a similar pattern to give students support. Then look at the words going across each row. When a student's reading across the rows, they have to carefully examine each word when they move from column to column, and that's more challenging for them. Let's look at how this strategy works. The student starts out by listening to and reading along with a narrator who reads the words going first down the columns and then across the rows. They might do this several times to really get confident with reading those words with the narrator. Then the student reads quietly aloud independently, starting out the same way, going down each column and then across each row for 1 minute. They can still click on any words they don't know and continue reading. When the timer sounds, they click on the last word they read, and they do this several times until they meet their words per minute goal. We're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about multisyllabic words. It's a big milestone in phonics and word recognition. We know that by the middle grades, students are encountering much longer words. Most of the words they encounter in print are words of 7 or more letters that have 2 or more syllables. And that's really challenging for students who are struggling to decode words. And the research tells us that students can be taught to chunk multisyllabic words into units that can be decoded. We also know that once students can accurately decode single syllable words and pronounce all of the typical vowel combinations, there are 2 additional skills they need to successfully decode multisyllabic words. They have to be able to pronounce prefixes and suffixes in isolation, and they need to be able to decode open and closed syllables. Here's what the research tells us about affixes. We know that 80% of all words have at least one prefix or suffix. So if students know the prefixes and suffixes, they can quickly recognize them as chunks within those multisyllabic words. That tells us that affixes are worth teaching. There are a limited number of them, and they occur frequently. So that makes it worth our time in our classrooms to spend some time working on these important word parts. Here's another takeaway for you. It's a table that organizes the most common prefixes and suffixes along with an example word for each one. And this takeaway is on page 27 in your handout. Here's an example lesson to help students build automaticity with multisyllabic words. It starts off with a lesson that presents specific suffixes. You can see these are suffixes that the narrator is going to read along with the student to give them an opportunity to pronounce those suffixes in isolation. Then the student will practice reading the suffixes again independently on flashcards. And we have these chalkboards that each have a different suffix on them. They're going to practice reading the words in isolation. Then they're going to read the words the way we really say them. So every time they click on a chalkboard, they'll see something like this. The audio narrator will pronounce each syllable and then the whole word the way we really say it. And students can practice this multiple times. Think about this for a minute. A student who develops their foundational reading skills quickly, they've had more exposure to vocabulary, background knowledge, and the language of books, will have an advantage in decoding these multisyllabic words. That student will self-correct more multisyllabic words when they're attempting to decode them because they're words they've heard before. And when they can get close to the correct pronunciation, they'll be able to recognize the word in text. Here's an example of a lesson that builds automaticity with multisyllabic words. Just like the word list I showed you before, the student's going to read along with the audio narrator as they pronounce each syllable in the word and then the whole word, going down the columns first and then across the rows. So the narrator would say, mistrustful, mistrustful, basketful, basketful, and so on. After listening to the words pronounced correctly, then the student practices reading the words independently with the option always to click on the word and hear it pronounced again. When the student meets their words per minute goal, they move on to the next step, which is reading the word list for their teacher. The last thing we're going to talk about with multisyllabic words today are open and closed syllables. And we know that the ability to pronounce open and closed syllables in isolation is an important skill for decoding multisyllabic words, because open and closed syllables make up almost 75% of syllables in English words. So students who are able to automatically read those open and closed syllables accurately will be better able to read multisyllabic words. Look at the sample words on this slide. Each of these words contains open and closed syllables. We teach our students that a vowel at the end of a syllable says its long sound, like low and K in relocation, or he in adhesive. We also teach them that when a syllable has a vowel not at the end of a syllable, it says its short sound, like pan in the word expansionism. So if a student has learned to read prefixes and suffixes by sight, like re and shun in the word relocation, ex, shun, and ism in the word expansionism, and ad and sieve in the word adhesive, and if they can also quickly and accurately pronounce the open or closed syllables in isolation, they'll be able to put all that together and read these words more accurately and automatically when they see them in text. Here are some more takeaways for you. There are full pages of these on pages 29 and 30 in your handout, and you can use them to create lessons that build automaticity using your current curriculum. You can select words that you want your students to practice from a phonics lesson, a spelling lesson, or a high-frequency word list. Try to select words for each column that have a common feature or pattern, and maybe use the final column for irregular spell-out words. Here's a sheet that your students can use to record their baseline score in blue before they practice, and then their hot score in red after practicing. And a third form that you can use and make flashcards at the top for reading prefixes, suffixes, or open and closed syllables in isolation before practicing multisyllabic words. The lessons I showed you earlier come from Word Warm-Ups Live, which is Read Naturally's online phonics intervention. It has 3 levels that focus on 1-syllable, 2-syllable, and multisyllabic words. Now let's talk about fluency. What is fluency? Well, simply, it's the ability to read like you speak. in terms of accuracy, rate, and expression. Non-fluent readers are going to struggle with at least one of these areas, and you probably have heard non-fluent readers in your classroom. They struggle to decode accurately and automatically, so they stumble over the words. They might substitute words for other words. This really impacts their comprehension. Think about this for a minute. In 10 minutes of independent reading, a proficient reader who reads 200 words per minute silently could read about 2,000 words, while in that same 10-minute period, an at-risk student who only reads 50 words per minute would read about 500 words. So we're giving them equal time to read, but definitely not an equal number of words read. And think about how that disparity will play out over the course of a school year. Our at-risk reader is going to read far less text, is exposed to far less vocabulary, may struggle to decode, so that they can't give as much focus to comprehension. And that can potentially lead to the downward spiral of reading failure we talked about in the first part of the webinar. So let's look at what the standards tell us about fluency. We want all of our students to read with accuracy and fluency in order to support comprehension. The research tells us, over 30 years of research tells us, that fluency is one of the critical foundational skills. It's highly correlated to comprehension. And we know that students become fluent by reading and practicing more. So what do? How do we give them more time, more effective time to read? Do we just schedule a block of time every day for students to read independently? I certainly had that time scheduled for me in my classroom, but my at-risk students during that independent reading time were not really reading. And you probably have seen the same thing in your classroom. My at-risk students would get a book that looked like the books everybody else was reading and pretend to read, or they would spend a lot of time in my classroom library looking at books that were just right for them. Research analyzed by the National Reading Panel suggests that just encouraging our at-risk students to read independently is not the most effective way to improve reading achievement. So how do we explicitly teach our students to read more fluently? Once again, the National Reading Panel found data supporting several effective strategies. The first one, teacher modeling, consists of a proficient reader modeling correct pronunciation, rate, and expression while reading with a less able reader. So this could be the teacher modeling, it could be a partner, choral reading. Those are all examples of teacher modeling. Or a student can read along with a recording. Next is repeated reading. And this is a very powerful strategy for improving reading fluency. And it's mastery learning. A student is practicing the same text over and over until they're able to read it fluently. And then that experience transfers to other texts that they encounter later on. We also know that students are motivated and their performance improves when they can see feedback on their own progress. And that's where progress monitoring comes in. That was the red and blue graph I showed you earlier, where students mark their own scores. And I'll show you another example of that in a minute. So let's look at some more lessons that guide students through the steps to develop fluency as they're reading a nonfiction story. This lesson starts out by emphasizing comprehension. We talk with our students about making a prediction for the story. It prepares the students to read the story, and it reminds them that they're reading for information. The teacher and the students decide on a prediction together after looking at the picture, looking at the title, and looking at the key words of the story to help them. The teacher writes the prediction sentence that the group agrees on, and then we've got the first part of our progress monitoring strategy, the cold timing. The teacher is going to time the group for 1 minute while they read out loud. Students will underline the words they don't know as they read. And this sets a baseline for measuring their improvement on reading this story. After they're finished reading and their teacher and they figure out their score, they record and graph their individual cold timing scores in blue on their fluency graphs. There's a visual representation for their timing score so that students can see their progress. Next, students continue reading on fluency as they read the story along with the teacher. This is the teacher modeling component, and it supports our students as they learn new words, confirm what difficult words are, and master sight words. The teacher is also going to be modeling appropriate phrasing and expression for the students. So the teacher and the students are going to read the story together from the flip book as she's doing here in the example, or you could also do it on a PowerPoint slide if you have a whole class. The teacher needs to be sure to read slowly enough so that the students can actually read along and pause to decode words with the featured sound. The teacher reads the story along with the students several times until students have learned the words. Next, students are going to do repeated readings independently for 1 minute to improve their fluency and master the story. If a teacher has a small group working with her, she'll time the whole group several times and listen to one story read during each timing while the others read quietly independently. She'll keep timing the students until she's heard everybody read independently and recorded their score. And she would record that up here at the top. And then students are going to be practicing until they can reach their words correct per minute goal. They're going to mark their graphs in red to show their final timing scores. And that, again, is that progress monitoring. Students can see their progress. Now we're going to emphasize comprehension. Now that students have mastered reading the story, we're going to talk about what they understood in the story. They'll complete sentences about the story and write a sentence about what the story is about. Again, we're encouraging our students to remember what they have read so that they're not speed reading during the previous steps and reminding them that they're reading for meaning. We're also supporting their phonics development by giving them an opportunity to write words with the featured phonics patterns. Next, in the sentence activity, students will apply their decoding skills by reading sentences containing words made from the letters and sounds they've been taught in this lesson and previous lessons. The teacher will read the first 2 sentences with the students, then the students will read independently and mark the featured phonics pattern. So they're still being exposed to that element. In the spell out words activity, students will practice writing words from the story to develop their phonemic awareness and spelling skills. The teachers and students will read, spell, and read each spell out word together as the students write the letters on the lines. And finally, we have the sound out words activity, where the teacher dictates 4 sound out words and students write each word on the lines in their student booklets. Remember, developing the skills of phonics and word recognition and spelling also helps students improve their automaticity and accuracy in decoding, which leads to increased fluency and better comprehension. So again, these examples are from our GATE Plus program, which is our print-based, and we have some other programs that incorporate the strategies of teacher modeling, repeated reading, and progress monitoring, Encore and word warm-ups. And then we also have our online platform, Read Live, that has 4 programs that use the same strategy. I hope you've enjoyed the 2-part webinar on foundational reading skills and that you've learned something that you can take back and use in your classroom. Remember, each foundational skill is a building block, and knowing some of the research that tells us what's important and how to teach these critical skills most effectively will add to your toolbox, your knowledge base, as you plan instruction to meet standards. So keep those research-based strategies in mind and try some of them along with the takeaways we've talked about today to get better results with your current curriculum. You can also check out the Read Naturally website for specific information about each of our programs that are based on this key research. There's also a white paper on the website that might be interesting if you want to learn more about the science behind the foundational reading skills. So thanks again so much for joining me today. There's our contact information up here. And if there are any questions in the chat, I'd be glad to answer them.